If you want a plastic straw or a bag in the northwestern Ontario city of Fort Francis, you're out of luck. They were the first municipality in the province to ban single-use plastics. A similar ban is coming in 2022 across the country. With us now for how to make it work in Fort Francis, Municipal Councillor Douglas Judson. In Orangeville, Ontario, Joanne St. Godard, Executive Director of the Circular Innovation Council. And in the provincial capital, Karen Wersig, Plastics Program Manager at Environmental Defense. Hi to you all.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Well, to get us started, let's take a look at what single plastics we're talking about. In November, the federal government released draft regulations to ban 6 kinds of single-use plastics, and this is to take effect across the country in late 2022. They include plastic checkout bags, cutlery and straws, food serviceware made from or containing problematic plastics, ring carriers, and stir sticks. I want to get an idea of what you all think about this plan. And Councillor Judson, I'll start with you. Is it a good plan?
Well, I think it's a great way to show leadership on a global problem, and we've started to pilot some of this initiative in Fort Francis with our bylaw, which targets a subset of those plastics with some products that we know have widely available alternatives. So I hope that decision makers in higher levels of government are watching the experience of communities like mine and the positive citizen uptake of these initiatives to craft their own agenda and to implement these regulations so that we have some consistency from coast to coast.
And in a few moments, we're going to be speaking about how you've done it. Joanne, is this a good plan?
Yeah, I think what's really important to mention here is that the bans on these particular products or packaging are actually part of a multi-pronged approach that the federal government has chosen with this regulation. So it will be supported by national recycling targets, mandatory responsibilities for the producers and manufacturers that put plastics onto the marketplace to make them more responsible for them, and plus, most importantly, a requirement that packaging and products of plastics actually contain a lot of recycled plastic material as well to increase the value. So bans as part of a multi-pronged approach is the right way to go.
And Karen, in your view, is this the good plan?
Yeah, it's very good. As a start, I think I agree with what Joanne says, that it's a start on what needs to be a much more comprehensive plan to address plastic pollution in Canada and around the world. But we're excited to see the bans finally announced, and we would like to see them implemented and put into force no later than the end of this year.
Joanne, are there any exemptions to this plan?
Yeah, I think the government is looking very carefully to make sure that that in fact there are no unintended consequences with respect to some of the alternatives that might replace. We don't want more impacts as a result of that. There is some discussions around things like straws and people with disabilities to make sure that they still have access to those. But the good thing is that industry has already demonstrated that they're prepared to innovate. There are really careful considerations of these first items that are chosen. There's a science-based criteria behind to give it rationale. And most importantly, industries are already demonstrating that they are innovating, providing consumers with alternatives to these options. So a really good first start.
Councillor Judson, Joanne mentioned that there are exemptions for people with disabilities who need straws. When you enacted the plastics ban in Fort Francis, did you make any exceptions?
We did. This was an issue that we've tried to strike a balance on. So while the bylaw prohibits the business from making those straws available by default or automatically, they're available upon request. And that's an issue we do continue to monitor because we have had some citizen advocates who have raised this concern, and we want to make sure that we strike the right balance between making sure that all of our businesses are providing those measures of accessibility and inclusion, and that we're not alienating anyone through the bylaw. But it is something that's been top of mind here.
And Karen, allowing plastic straws for people with disabilities is one thing, but were more disabilities and the needs associated with them considered?
I mean, the federal government followed the consultation that they have been conducting for more than a year. And I think straws were the key accessibility issue that were raised. I would just like to mention that there's another major exemption in the regulation, which will allow Canadian manufacturers and plastics makers to continue exporting these harmful and unrecyclable products around the world. And we'd like to see that loophole closed. If Canada has decided that these materials are bad for the environment, we shouldn't be exporting them and dumping them elsewhere in the world.
Countries, I just want to follow up on that because countries like Rwanda, since 2008, they've had really firm regulations in place. You can actually face jail time if you're caught with a plastic bag. In Kenya in 2017, if you're anyone selling, producing, or using plastic bags, you can face imprisonment or up to 4 years in prison and fines of up to $40,000. Obviously, we don't want to see that kind of ban in Canada. But is it maybe because we're going through a pandemic and to enact such a harsh ban where you can't export might actually affect and impact business in a negative way, Karen?
Well, I think what we're seeing with climate and what we're seeing with plastic pollution is the need to transition away from these destructive kinds of products and practices. And so there's so much economic opportunity in things like reuse systems that would allow us to use more durable packaging and products and containers over and over and over again in what is truly a circular economy approach, and not worry so much about protecting an industry that really is going to have to transition away. The plastics industry, the petrochemical industry, is an extension of the fossil fuel industry. And so as we in Canada and around the world wind down our reliance on fossil fuels, plastic's not going to be so cheap and cheerful and seemingly convenient as it is today. And we are going to have to transition away from that. And I think the sooner we think about that and do it fairly for the workers that are involved in that industry, the better. And there are so many job opportunities that come and job growth opportunities that come with reuse and a circular economy. Reuse, repair of products, this is what I hope that we can start thinking about as opposed to trying to protect an industry that's on its way out.
I want to read something from Canada's National Observer, and this is from Mark Fawcett Atkinson in July of 2021. And he writes, every day, about 160 tractor trailers full of plastic waste cross the border between Canada and the United States, with about half going in each direction. They are a key link in a scrap plastic trade worth $18.8 million. But few details exist about what happens to these shipments on either side of the border. It is unclear if they're recycled, dumped in a landfill, sent overseas, or burned as fuel. Karen, a year ago, most countries, including Canada, signed the Basel Convention, which prohibits the cross-border trading of plastic waste. If that's the case, how can this still be happening?
Well, first of all, the US is not signatory to the Basel Convention, unfortunately. And Canada and the US have signed a deal, I think Mark referred to it there as a secretive deal, to continue cross-border trade. I mean, Joanne knows that there are legitimate plastics exports that go to legitimate recyclers. I think there's probably not enough oversight of this process. I don't think we know exactly what happens to all of the plastics that are exported. There was just a report this week, and in fact, it came out in English today, about Canadian plastic waste ending up mixed in paper waste and sent to India, where it's being burned. So we know there's a lot of plastics are not an easy material to recycle. And a lot of the flexible plastics that we use every day are, a recent report out of Canada suggests only 3% of those are recycled. And basically none of that is out of the blue box. So we really do have to rethink, A, how much plastic we're using here and what types of plastic, and B, monitor those exports to make sure that they're actually being sent to proper recycling facilities with environmentally sound recycling practices.
To hear that only 3% is being recycled, Joanne, I wanted to give you the floor since Karen mentioned you.
Yeah, sure. And just picking up on Karen's point, I think, I talked about this regulation connected to bans being part of many tools in the regulatory toolbox. And we've called for, as an organization, many times for the need to actually have better data, better tracking, better reporting, not only with respect to, the targets that Canada is about to set at a provincial level with extended producer responsibility regulations as well, but again, internationally, to make sure that we know exactly what it is that we're generating, what types of materials are part of these more aggregated shipments, where they're ended up, ultimately, not just what countries they pass through, which, folks know that many or much of what we're generating in Canada is going through the U.S. to other destinations where they just don't have the facilities or the manpower to deal with it responsibly. And so we have to make sure that better tracking and reporting protocols are in place as part of this regulatory package, so that we can have a better line of sight.
And I want to bring it back to this ban that's going to be taking place by the end of 2022. Joanne, what was the reaction of industry and plastic producers to this ban?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a recognition broadly by industry. I can't speak for any one sector or any one industry, but I can say that there's, I think, on a global level, there's a recognition that there's much more plastics produced than is ending up in the recycling system. We have this, these less than 10% of what we're generating on an annual basis and putting onto the marketplace is ending up in recycling systems. And I don't think there's anybody, regardless of whether you work for government or industry or environmental organizations, that says that that's acceptable. So, while industry knows that they'll need to adjust, that they've got to examine the kinds of products and packaging that they're putting onto the marketplace, they know that they need to be part of the end of life solutions, and they know that actually they have to maybe pivot in some cases, producing less of those kinds of plastics that can be recycled, and looking for alternatives to these things that we describe and define as single use. So the industry knows that they are part of the solution, and they're very actively at the table.
And we know we do have somebody on the panel whose municipality has gone through this. Councillor Judson, why did Fort Frances want to be the first in Ontario to take this on?
I think our council was really motivated by an opportunity to demonstrate that we can use local government, we can use municipal jurisdiction in Ontario to contribute towards larger problems in our world and across our country. And so that's the pitch that I took to council when I brought this forward, is that we have an opportunity here to demonstrate that our citizens are behind these types of changes, that our businesses, our consumers, know they need to make these changes, and we can demonstrate leadership by nudging them in the right direction. And so that was the method behind the madness that brought this forward a few years ago, and we have given it quite a bit of runway to get off the ground, to make sure everyone has time to adapt and exhaust any existing inventories. But the reception has been very positive, overwhelmingly positive, and I'm very proud of it for our community.
What's the support been like for the plan in the town?
Just an example, we recently, due to the supply chain issues during the pandemic, we had some businesses ask for a little bit more time before the penalties under the bylaw came into force. And the reason they asked was not to delay enforcement, not because they don't want to comply with the bylaw, but it's because their customers ask them uncomfortable questions when they're not complying with the bylaw. So the political will is there, and people are, I think, very enthusiastic about this, and they're very proud that our community is doing this. I buy grocery, like I go to Walmart like everyone else, and I listen to hear what people are saying, and generally it's overwhelmingly positive. I don't hear people complaining. I hear people sort of saying, more communities should be doing this. This really should be more universal. We should do more. And probably the most important thing is that because of these small changes we've made, which I admit aren't enough, they're starting to cause people to voluntarily question what other decisions they can make outside of these prescribed regulations we have at the municipal level. They're starting to think about, what other impacts am I causing that I could address by making different choices?
I'm thinking too, I hate to admit this to this panel, but people are creatures of comfort, right? You go to the store, you expect to get your plastic bag, And there's been times when I just kind of like, ooh, I just want my plastic bag. So, it's one thing to change policy, but how do you change culture to get everybody to buy in on this? And I would like to get everybody's view on this, but Councillor Judson, how did you do that?
We did it by starting off with some consultations with some of the groups that we knew might have the biggest impacts. And so I first started shopping the idea with our business community. We talked a bit about industry impact earlier on the panel, but small businesses in a community that are buying these types of products to carry out their transactions are directly impacted at the front lines. And even there was a lot of support. But once the bylaw was enacted, we leaned on our municipal administration, who've done an exceptional job reaching out to business, making sure there was educational materials that were circulated in the community. And I think one thing that's really important to note is that we are a small community. We're census yesterday says we have 7,700 people who live here. And so we have an opportunity to pilot ideas like this where, frankly, it's far less work and it's a little bit easier than in larger centers because we have limited media, because there are only 3 grocery stores, and it's not nearly as much work to get these things going or to make changes if we learn something critical along the way.
Karen, it is one thing to change policy, but how do you get cultural buy-in on something like this?
Oh, I think we're there. I mean, Canadians overwhelmingly, time after time, say they want to do something about plastic pollution. And I think what's important to note, and Councillor Judson said this well, which is once the rules are in place, it also incentivizes people to think about how they live and do things differently. And so that's why even starting with a ban of 6 items nationally gets people thinking, it gets businesses thinking about how to do things differently. It gets us thinking about, okay, I really do need to bring my own bags to the grocery store. It's not hard, and what I really hope it also does is get businesses and the governments, local, provincial, and national governments, thinking about how to incentivize also reuse systems that make reuse convenient. So containers at stores, containers at restaurants that we can take back easily to very accessible depots, maybe on a deposit system. They can be washed out and sold to us again, so that we're not generating these kind of piles in our blue boxes that we know, well, the majority of which cannot be recycled if it's plastic. The other materials, yes, but when it's plastic, no.
We're talking about the gains, which is a great thing, but as we know, whenever we have these shifts, there's always a cost somewhere. Joanne, in your view, who will end up bearing the cost of banning these single-use plastics?
Well, I might want to ask a different question, which is who bears the cost if we don't start dealing with plastic waste? And the Councillor Judson knows that ultimately and predominantly it is the municipal sector who has to deal with inaction. And so when they look at filling landfills and dealing with more expensive recycling programs through Blue Box, because there's such a proliferation of different types of plastics and plastics that are getting harder and harder to recycle, there is a cost to not starting to address this pollution. So, and I think we forget sometimes that, that to account for that or to equate for that. So there is an accounting for change, there's no doubt. But to Karen's point, because industry is so nimble and they're so innovative, they're going to be able to fill a gap with the opportunity. So as we get out of single use and we look at more refill, more reuse, more durability, I have no doubt that industry will fill that economic opportunity. So there will be some short-term pain in the sense of these things will have to come off production lines. But as I say, there's no doubt that industry will fill them with more economic opportunities with different kinds of products and packaging.
And Karen, what are we going to be replacing these plastics with?
Well, hopefully, ideally in the long run, reuse. I mean, I know in the short term, companies are looking for replacements of those single-use plastics that are on the ban list. Ultimately, we can't just replace all our single-use plastics with single-use paper, glass, or metals. Plastic really dawned an era of single use after the Second World War. And it's that culture that we have to get away from, this idea that we can just use things once and then throw it away. It's not the way the world works. The planet cannot stand that. So, that's why the bans are a good opportunity to start really forcing us all to think about that and to think about how to get into more circular, durable packaging. But in the short term, we do see the likelihood that there will be be probably more paper around. And the one thing I'll say about paper is it's not great for the environment to use paper once and throw it away. Certainly not. But once it does end up in landfills or hopefully in composters or in the natural environment, it will break down much more safely than plastic. So, in the meantime, we will be doing our environment a big service by getting more and more of these non-recyclable plastics that end up littered in our environment out of our environment.
Is it enough? Because I mentioned earlier that in Rwanda has been doing this since 2008. That's 14 years ahead of us. Are we ignoring bigger plastic problems by turning an eye on other plastic uses and practices? Karen?
Well, I think there's a lot more to do. I mean, more than 50 groups signed on to a call this week to the federal government to do more and faster on the plastics problem. Joanne outlined some of the measures they can take, and I agree with Councillor Judson that it's great when the federal government can take a leadership role, because it does create some kind of conformity and across the country, which is helpful. But the pressure from below is also really helpful. Like, it's great to know that this has happened in Fort Francis. It's been successful. People like it. And so, yes, we need more innovations from below to figure out what we can actually do together to limit plastic proliferation and to limit plastic pollution. We have a whole laundry list of items that we hope the government does, including, as I say, incentivizing reuse and requiring reuse, and really making companies responsible for the full life cycle costs of the products they put out on the market.
Joanne, what are some of the materials producers are reverting to be able to abide by this ban?
I think, and I've had some conversations with product designers and some of the industry that's looking at, of course, different materials, fiber and paper being one of them for sure, but also looking at other bioplastics or more compostable packaging. The key there is that we have to make sure that packaging, although it may not come from fossil fuel sources in terms of its production, and it comes from more renewable sources, we have to make sure that we can get some value out of it at its end of life. And so we have to make things that are able to be taken in by our green bin programs, that are successfully can be broken down within compostable programs or composting programs that are sort of common to the municipal sector. And then ultimately looking at this refill, which really is the pinnacle to try to minimize the amount of production cycles, but also allowing us to really reduce consumption at the end of the day and production. So, I mean, I think there's different angles here, and because you're getting such a wide diversity, stir sticks, straws, and takeout containers, there's opportunity to explore all of those alternatives.
Speaking of alternatives, Councillor Judson, we're going to have to find something to replace the single plastics. Are you looking at the reduction in plastic use in Fort Francis? Are you worried that now you're creating new forms of pollution?
Well, I don't have any data on that to really support that hypothesis. I'm sure our waste management people will be keeping tabs on how this unfolds. For the most part, I think that, going back to my earlier comments, people are making more environmentally conscious decisions as a result of what's happened. So I generally think that we are seeing waste reduction across the board. We're seeing more reuse of the alternative products that they are deciding to adopt. And I also wanted to just go back to an earlier comment about how important it is to have this pressure and momentum from down below. I think too often we are looking as municipalities on federal and provincial governments to lead and solve a problem and rescue us from a predicament. And they can do that far more efficiently when we at the local level demonstrate to them that our communities want this, they like this, they're good at this, and that it's resulting in cost savings and environmental protection for the places we live.
Change can be scary, but it doesn't have to be. So I'd like to get some advice from all of you on how we can enact this ban provincially, federally. And Councillor Judson, I'd like to start with you. Any advice?
Well, it goes really to communication with the community. That's been really from the outset what we set out to do. We gave a long runway to implementing the policy, and it's been graduated over a period of time to make sure that everyone had the tools and information they needed to adapt. And we've had to make some adaptations as a result of supply chain challenges during the pandemic as well. But that's the key thing is that communication and being a partner to businesses and consumers that are trying to, in good faith, make these changes. And I think that will bear fruit for any government that wants to tackle this challenge.
And Joanne?
Yeah, just to pick up on those themes, I think this is a production and a consumption issue, and so it's going to be we're going to have a role as consumers and residents to support and participate in the change, and on the flip side of that, industry has to give us alternatives, gives us choices, keep these convenience items and the alternatives that they'll replace them with as convenient as possible. So it'll be a multi-pronged and sort of multi-stakeholder approach to making this successful.
And Karen?
Yeah, I think clear communication. I mean, this is happening. This is when it's happening. Let's get ready. And let's make sure we're making good choices. I really think that the model from Fort Frances is excellent and should be used as a case study across Canada to implement these kinds of changes.
Joanne, what's the timeline going forward with regards to Canada-wide implementation of the plastics ban?
Yeah, so the implementation is scheduled for 2022. So we're looking at really by the end of this calendar year, we'll have to be prepared to moving into the ban requirements, and then the government will simultaneously be putting out other discussion papers on other aspects of the plastic waste directive that they are moving forward.
Thank you all so much for your insights. We really do appreciate it. And Councillor Judson, well done to Fort Frances on this. We really do appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you. We're very proud of it.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.